Hello and a very warm welcome to Bharata First. I'm Rausan Pereira. This is FRP Explains. You asked for it and we are going to bring it to you. Several of you wanted to know the history of the Israel-Palestinian issue, and I have prepared a detailed history in this special edition of FRP Explains, and we're going to try and bring you 3,000 years of history of the conflict between the Arabs and the Jews in a matter of just 12 minutes. So sit back and enjoy the show. But before we do that, let me just once again remind you to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. And also for those of you who would like to come forward and contribute, here are the UPI IDs. A small contribution that you make will go a long way in us bringing you this content. Let's begin with the history of Israel and Palestine conflict. Israel is a small country in West Asia, about the size of one of our northeastern states, Manipur or Meghalaya, and half the size of Haryana. It is located on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea and bordered by Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. The nation of Israel, with a population of more than 9 million people, most of them Jewish, has many important archaeological and religious sites considered sacred by Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike, and a complex history with periods of peace and conflict. Much of what scholars know about Israel's ancient history comes from the Hebrew Bible. According to the text, Israel's origins can be traced back to Abraham, who is considered the father of both Judaism through his son Isaac and Islam through his son Ishmael. Abraham's descendants were thought to be enslaved by the Egyptians for hundreds of years before settling in Canaan, which is approximately the region of modern-day Israel. The word Israel comes from Abraham's grandson Jacob, who was renamed Israel by the Hebrew God in the Bible. King David ruled the region around 1000 BC. His son, who became King Solomon, is credited with building the first holy temple in ancient Jerusalem. In about 931 BC, the area was divided into two kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judea in the south. Around 722 BC, the Assyrians invaded and destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. In 568 BC, the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the first temple, which was replaced by the second temple in about 516 BC. For the next several centuries, the land of modern-day Israel was conquered and ruled by various groups, including the Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Fatimids, Seljuk Turks, Crusaders, Egyptians, Mamelukes, Islamists, and others. From 1517 to 1917, Israel, along with much of West Asia, was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. But World War I dramatically altered the geopolitical landscape in the region. In 1917, at the height of the war, British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour submitted a letter of intent supporting the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The British government hoped that the formal declaration, known thereafter as the Balfour Declaration, would encourage support for the Allies in World War I. When World War I ended in 1918 with an Allied victory, the 400-year-old Ottoman Empire rule ended, and Great Britain took control over what became known as Palestine, modern-day Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. The Balfour Declaration and the British Mandate to Palestine were approved by the League of Nations in 1922. Arabs vehemently opposed the Balfour Declaration, concerned that a Jewish homeland would mean the subjugation of Arab Palestinians. The British controlled Palestine until Israel, in the years following the end of World War II, became an independent state in 1947. Throughout Israel's long history, tensions between Jews and Arab Muslims have existed. The complex hostility between the two groups dates all the way back to ancient times when they both populated the area and deemed it holy. Both Jews and Muslims consider the city of Jerusalem sacred. It contains the Temple Mount, which includes the holy sites, Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Western Wall, the Dome of the Rock, and more. Much of the conflict in recent years has centered on who is occupying the following areas. Gaza Strip, a piece of land located between Egypt and modern-day Israel. Golan Heights, a rocky plateau between Syria and modern-day Israel. West Bank, a territory that divides part of modern-day Israel and Jordan. The United Nations approved a plan to partition Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state in 1947, but the Arabs rejected it. In May 1948, Israel was officially declared an independent state, with David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, as the Prime Minister. While this historic event seemed to be a victory for Jews, it also marked the beginning of more violence with the Arabs. Following the announcement of an independent Israel, 5 Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, immediately invaded the region in what became known as the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Civil war broke out throughout all of Israel, but a ceasefire agreement was reached in 1949. As part of the temporary armistice agreement, the West Bank became part of Jordan, and the Gaza Strip became Egyptian territory. Numerous wars and acts of violence between Arabs and Jews have ensued since the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Some of these include SUEZ crisis. Relations between Israel and Egypt were rocky in the years following the 1948 war. In 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser overtook and nationalized the Suez Canal, the important shipping waterway that connects the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. With the help of British and French forces, Israel attacked the Sinai Peninsula and retook the Suez Canal. Six-Day War. In what started as a surprise attack, Israel in 1967 defeated Egypt, Jordan, and Syria in 6 days. After this brief war, Israel took control of the Gaza Strip, Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, and Golan Heights. These areas were considered occupied by Israel. Yom Kippur War. Hoping to catch the Israeli army off guard, in 1973, Egypt and Syria launched airstrikes against Israel on the holy day of Yom Kippur. The fighting went on for 2 weeks until the UN adopted a resolution to stop the war. Syria hoped to recapture the Golan Heights during the battle but was unsuccessful. In 1981, Israel annexed the Golan Heights, but Syria continued to claim it as territory. Lebanon War. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon and ejected the Palestine Liberation Organization. This group, which started in 1964 and declared all Arab citizens living in Palestine up to 1947 to be called Palestinians, focused on creating a Palestinian state within Israel. First Palestinian Intifada. Israeli occupation of Gaza and the West Bank led to a 1987 Palestinian uprising and hundreds of deaths. A peace process known as the Oslo Peace Accords ended the Intifada, an Arabic word meaning shaking off. After this, the Palestinian Authority formed and took over some territories in Israel. In 1997, the Israeli army withdrew from parts of the West Bank. Second Palestinian Intifada. Palestinians launched suicide bombs and other attacks on Israelis in 2000. The resulting violence lasted for years until a ceasefire was reached. Israel announced a plan to remove all troops and Jewish settlements from the Gaza Strip by the end of 2005. Second Lebanon War. Israel went to war with Hezbollah, a Shiite Islamic militant group in Lebanon, in 2006. A UN negotiated ceasefire ended the conflict a couple of months after it started. Hamas Wars. Israel has been involved in repeated violence with Hamas, a Sunni Islamist militant group that assumed Palestinian power in 2006. Some of the more significant conflicts took place beginning in 2008, 2012, and 2014. Clashes between Israelis and Palestinians are still commonplace. Key territories of land are divided, but some are claimed by both groups. For instance, they both cite Jerusalem as their capital. Both groups blame each other for terror attacks that kill civilians. While Israel doesn't officially recognize Palestine as a state, more than 135 UN member nations do. That's it in this special edition of FRP Explains. Once again, let me remind you that if you like the content, please subscribe, like the video, and then hit the bell icon. For those of you who would like to come forward and contribute, you may do so by using our UPI IDs. A small contribution that you make will go a long way in us bringing you the content. That's it from me. See you again next time.